Hey, what's happening, everyone? This is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here at Cultish. If you are interested in supporting Cultish, there's a lot that goes into this ministry, so if you are interested in partnering with us, you can go to thecultishtshow.com. You can donate one time or monthly, and there are some links there in the description, which you should be able to check out. Also, make sure you check out apologiastudios.com. You can become an all-access member. Supporting the studio will actually help support Cultish because we would not be possible. Everything we do would not be possible without everything that goes behind the scenes on a regular basis, so definitely check that out. Also, make sure you go to forgebeardco.com, get all the goodies for your beard. Forgebeardco.com/cultish, definitely check that out. And also make sure you go to shopcultish.com, which is all our merchandise goodies. So many of you have flaunted your designs and have tagged us on our social media, so definitely appreciate you sharing the word about our podcast. All right, so this is the first episode with Zach Lautenschlager. This is a good friend of ours, and we've been wanting to kind of delve into the world of right-wing politics specifically. So we had a time talking about that, and we kind of used the 2017 Netflix documentary, The Family, as a catalyst for that conversation. So we hope you enjoy the first part of this podcast and this conversation. We had a great time talking with Zach Lautenschlager. Enjoy the podcast. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, entering the kingdom of the cults. My name's Jeremiah Roberts. I'm one of the co-hosts here. I am here, joined once again by my trusted friend, co-host, all-around good guy and super sleuth, giving you the full resume in your super secret base / Cultish headquarters in Harriman, Utah, in your apartment. So
they're not so secret.
Not so secret
anymore.
But I'm super excited for this episode. It's good for you to be here. We are joined by one of our good friends, Mr. Zach Lautenschlager. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for the opportunity. Good to see you guys.
Good. I'm really glad to hang out. By the way, it's really great to see you in person. I feel like most of the time on Facebook, I usually get a care react from you.
Right.
But I can feel it's not just any care react. It's like
right. It's special.
Like Zach Lautenschlager cares. And so I just feel the warmth. I feel like even more the warmth of you just being here.
Well, thank you. I will say that you started the whole care react thing.
Yes,
so,
I know. I know. But it's also a lot, well, speaking of the warmth, it's a lot warmer in here than it is outside. I'm still kind of getting used to the flurry snow outside here in Utah. It's like, what is going on? It is April.
Isn't it great?
It's great. It's different. It's a little different than Arizona. I mean, we have to go up north for that. But yeah, I'm loving it though. But I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying being warm as of right now. So what you just heard there was a clip. We're going to be kind of from the Netflix documentary. It came out, I think, in 2017, which feels like forever ago. It's a Netflix series called The Family, which is talking about this super secret, kind of like a secret society, skull and bones, kind of secretive, working behind the scenes to push out their right-wing agenda. And so I thought it'd be kind of a fun opportunity to kind of just really talk about not just the documentary, because some of you may have not seen it, but kind of really talk about just like the world of politics as a whole, but even somewhat from the right-wing side, because that's where the documentary was aimed at. And so, Zach, could you just tell everyone just a little bit about yourself and kind of, I mean, you are kind of involved in that world that the documentary is kind of referring to. Just tell them just a little bit about yourself and kind of like what you're all about and what your involvement is in D.C.
Sure. So I'm the past vice president of the National Association for Gun Rights, 4.5 million members nationwide, served there for nearly a decade. I run my own political consulting business. I am a former registered lobbyist, federal lobbyist, so it's almost worse than being a lawyer, right? I run campaigns. I'm currently running a congressional campaign and a few other statewide campaigns across America. I build organizations, raise money for conservative causes, focus on the right to keep and bear arms, the right to life, and on limiting government. So
great.
That's what I do.
So you kind of have your own little like secret like C Street going on. Is there a way that we can join like later on? Can we talk about that afterwards?
Yeah. Yep. There's a very high dollar figure that's involved. So.
Okay. we'll have to talk it in. See if I can.
He straight said, "Can you afford it, Jerry? The secret membership." Have you ever been to the National Prayer Breakfast?
I've never been. Nope.
Okay.
No, that's invitation only, and it's for office holders mostly.
Okay. So let's just jump right into it. What if people have seen the documentary? So how would you for anyone who hasn't seen it, how would you describe this series and what it's talking about?
Well, what it's talking about is an interesting reality. I will use the abbreviation for it as far as describing the series itself. It's BS. It's straight up political hit job. It was released in August of 2019. So this is nothing more than an effort to influence the outcome of an election by sewing things together with inference. Even the critical reviews said they felt like the whole thing was muddled and repetitious. It just keeps going over the same material again and again. Could have been one show instead of 5. Ultimately, you want to watch it? Sure. I watched it on 1.5 speed, so I wouldn't have to wade through all of it, the whole thing. But there are some truths there. There are some realities there. And then there's a lot of obfuscating and a lot of trying to say that, well, because these people are Christians, therefore they're obviously involved in nefarious doings and trying to do bad things.
Right. And so the underlying premise of this, what's also interesting too, is that, this came out in 2019, which obviously everyone knows that 2020 was about 7 years long. And not only that, we've got the first year of the Biden administration. So even like watching that, it was like, oh yeah, like Trump was president? Like really? Oh yeah, I remember that. It feels like forever ago when you're kind of looking at the different aspects of it. So what I thought was interesting, and maybe we can kind of unravel this, is maybe explain maybe just a little bit how the political world really works. Because I think one of the things in this documentary is that it was trying to sort of articulate that this group, C Street, was kind of like the sort of secret society. There was the guy who was talking about, he had written a book about it, that he kind of got into it as a guy in college, and he kind of went through these like initiations. You see in the documentary how he's being toppled on top of they're playing some sort of
dog
game.
pile on him.
Yeah, the dog pile on him, and that's sort of his sort of like rite of passage. But it's always behind closed door, and you start seeing like all these like political figures coming to the house that he's working at, and it's all like very, very cultish and very cult. And he's like, what did I get myself into?
Sure.
Yeah, like how would you describe just a little bit about the political world that it's referring to? Because again, the premise is that it's the secret society, and they're trying to influence leaders through the prayer breakfast and kind of really trying to spread their ideology throughout the world. But it's almost as if they're acting as if no one else is doing that,
Sure, right.
But I think, how would you kind of like explain to everyone in layman's terms the political world as a whole, like from your perspective, and how those intricacies work? Because this is part of what you do.
Right. So it's important, first of all, for me to mention that I am a political outsider. I am not on the inside of a lot of this, and that's just a reality that I need to acknowledge. I have friends who are on the inside. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, a bad thing, whatever. I just don't want to misrepresent anything.
Yeah.
I came up in outside grassroots politics. I've worked for nearly 25 years. 1998 is when I started getting paid, when I graduated from high school. My dad ran for office when I was a little kid. He was deeply involved in making homeschooling legal in the state that I grew up in. He homeschooled me before it was legal. And so my father and grandfather, my mom's dad actually, were very politically involved from early on, before I was, on the scene. But it was all state level politics for the most part. And that's where I came up. I came up working in state politics. When I went to work for the National Association for Gun Rights in 2011, I went to work in state politics again. That was my area of expertise. I've lobbied in over 40 state legislatures. I had the opportunity to help build the team that has now passed constitutional carry in 25 states. Passed both chambers in Georgia late last week. Kemp hasn't signed it yet, but he's going to. And so eventually we needed help in D.C., and so I took over the D.C. office and I worked there. But I came in as a total outsider. There's a lot of kind of professional disdain between people who work state politics and people who work federal politics. It's all the same stuff. The federal legislative branch is just a larger, more chaotic, more noisy, and yes, probably more corrupt. Although you go to some of these state legislatures, you go to New York. You go to Illinois, there's a lot of corruption there too.
Oh, yeah.
So, but they're very similar. A legislative body is a legislative body. And so I came up working that. I worked in D.C. for 5-6 years. I have many friends on the Hill. And so, that's kind of my background, how I came up into this. When I started working in politics, I wore bib overalls because I farmed and ranched, and that's what we wore in South Dakota. You know? So, don't picture, I just want to paint that picture of where I'm coming from. Working in D.C. and getting to know many, many friends there. I'm actually headed there this afternoon. The super secret base the rebel base that we're in actually happens to be relatively close to the Salt Lake City International Airport. And I'll be flying out this afternoon to take one of my clients to D.C. to introduce her around and meet with some prospective supporters and that kind of thing. There's the interesting thing about the American political scene is that anybody can walk into it. I walked onto it off a ranch in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota. Discovered that, I can do that. Can I get involved and influence the outcome of elections by working for candidates, by raising the money that's necessary, by putting out the communications? This is what it's all about. And many Americans have this deeply seated discomfort with politics, which is good. We don't like the way our government functions. In fact, I was looking at numbers yesterday, and since 2017, it's pretty solid numbers between 65 and 70% of the people in America. This is of a sample size of over 400,000 people over 5 to 10 years. Every week, they're doing polling, and you can go through and look at those numbers week by week by week. You've got 65 to 70% of the American populace says that we're going the wrong direction. We don't like government. We don't like the way this works. And it's just a great number. Discomfort and dislike for politics is, from my perspective, partially a good thing. At least distrust of politicians is a good thing. Yeah. There's a reason why in Canada churches got shut down. And here, when the people tried to do that, there were churches who voluntarily did so. But in every church that said, we're not doing it, bite us, they won. Right. Or the government ignored them because they didn't want to get in trouble. Right. And so that is the beauty of the habits of the heart of the American populace. Are there many problems in American culture today? Yes. There are deep problems. There's some deep trouble there. Right. But there's still this memory of distrust and dislike for politicians. Oh, yeah. Which is great.
I have a question, too, because in this documentary, we hear this all the time throughout. Like you said, it's very repetitious. It's the separation between church and state, the free establishment cause. And they use that as their foundation to make the argument that anybody that is Christian, essentially, should not be involved in politics, that there is this underlying worldview that is staging our government.
So dishonest.
Yeah. Can you explain that? Because you've got very good biblical mindset, number one. Number two, I think you have a very good historical outlook on the founding of the United States of America. Can you give us what the separation of church and state is biblically, and then how it works here in the United States?
Okay, so biblically, from my perspective, I do come from what I would refer to as a theonomic perspective. Theonomos simply means God's law, or God is law. I believe that the laws of God do apply to civil government the way they apply to everything else. I also believe that God himself clearly lays out these laws are within the jurisdiction of civil government, and these laws are not. So there's jurisdictional thinking. And so just from the get-go, does God's law apply to government? Well, of course, there are human beings involved in government, and God's law applies to all human beings and therefore all human institutions. It's hard to get away from that biblically. The only way you can do that is to divorce the Bible from Christianity, which is a popular pastime for many people, right? Including, you can go back and you can look at some of the problems, some of the sins that our forefathers were involved in, including Thomas Jefferson removing the miracles of Christ from the Bible, right? And he made his own Bible. It was just the things that Jesus said because he liked that. Right. Interestingly enough, he appeared to have repented from that before he died, and he was able to tell his Calvinistic, unfortunately somewhat Unitarian-leaning friend, John Adams, I'm a Christian now, whereas before he had told him, I would rather go to hell than believe in the Calvinist God. Wow. Right. And so interesting personal journeys for these guys, but they are the very unusual exception to the rule. You can look at most of the men who signed the Declaration. You take any measure you want of what's a founding father. Did they write stuff? Did they sign documents? Whatever. The vast majority of them have very orthodox Christian or Orthodox Christian statements when they die. Their last will and testament is, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and his shed blood, and my only hope of salvation is in him. You have these very solid Orthodox statements. And there are many people who will point to that and say, see, that makes us a Christian nation, right? Now, do I believe there can be Christian nations? Sure. Do I believe America is one? Well, what do we mean by that? Do we mean a nation whose laws are based on the parts of God's law that he has applied to civil government? Well, then yes, I would say that is the definition of a Christian nation, a nation whose laws are based on the parts of God's law that God says apply to civil government.
Yeah.
And then you have to ask, okay, how well are we applying that? Are we still doing that, right? And that's what's in question. There are many people who point to America today and say it's not a Christian nation. So that gets, that's that whole discussion of what is the proper jurisdiction? How does this separate? Well, under the New Covenant, it is very clear that there is a functional or an organizational separation between church and state. Whereas under the Old Covenant, a person would be a magistrate by virtue of his office as a priest. Mm-hmm. It was not that one person can hold two offices. It's that it was one and the same office. A priest was a magistrate at a certain level. Under the New Covenant, that is no longer the case. A pastor or a spiritual leader, someone who holds office in the church, is not, by virtue of his office, also an office holder in the civil government.
Right.
And so there is a functional, it's hard to deny, however you want to cut the cake, there is a functional separation of the structure of church and the structure of state. So, let's start with that. We have documents from founding fathers that phrase separation of church and state comes from no American founding document, comes from a letter that Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists who were concerned that either the Church of England or a certain Presbyterian perspective or whatever would become, and yes, I know you Baptists are always a little bit afraid of the Presbyterians on this side of the table, right? Had to throw that dig in there somewhere.
We knew it was coming.
Yeah. But the Danbury Baptists had written Jefferson to ask him, how is this going to work? Are we going to have to pay a tax to the church? Because in Europe, traditionally, there had been a state church that was established by the civil government, and everyone was taxed, and then that money would be paid to the church. And so the church had a taxing power. And so Jefferson's perspective was, no, there is a wall of separation institutionally between these, which, as far as Jefferson was saying, I actually agree with him to that level. Nowhere did you see that concept being used to, for example, limit Christians' involvement in civil government. In fact, it was required that you believe in the existence of God before your testimony could be accepted in a court of law. And that is an absolute violation of what people today mean when they say separation of church and state. They would say that's a religious test. No, that has nothing to do with what our founders meant when they wrote in the Constitution there will not be a religious test. That means you will have to subscribe to one certain particular religion, specifically some branch of the Christian religion. But the idea that you could have an atheist who would say, I don't believe in the existence of God, and then that their testimony would be accepted in court, was abhorrent to our founding fathers, because they said, if you don't believe in the existence of God, then you don't believe in any consequence for lying.
Right.
Right.
If there's no God, then where's the consequence for lying if no one else knows?
Right.
Right. So what is the free establishment clause then?
Right. And so the First Amendment often gets thrown around, right? Let's look it up and read it so that we can actually, I would quote it here, but I would probably get it wrong. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. There are 5 rights defended in the First Amendment. And so you're asking, what about the Establishment Clause? Okay, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So Congress is limited from establishing a state church. Okay. Now, does that mean that Teddy Roosevelt was violating the Constitution when he frequently used what he called the bully pulpit and coined that term to represent Christian morality and to call on the men of America to behave in a certain way because it was Christian. Does this mean that George Washington was wrong when he referred to the pillars of religion and morality, faith and morality, as to uphold any kind of reasonable civil government? No, that's laughable. It's absurd. What people today mean when they say separation of church and state, they mean separation of Christians from government. That Christians shouldn't be involved. That if you're going to be a Christian, it has to stay in your deep, dark closet somewhere, and you better not ever say anything about it in public.
So pretty much the Free Establishment Clause was to stop things from happening like the Anglican Church in England or the Roman Catholic Church in Italy, like this
Correct.
one federal government church head body, essentially.
It was limiting what the federal government could do in establishing one church over another.
Right.
And our founders would have been flabbergasted to suggest, if anyone had suggested, well, good, sure, I'm glad you made it illegal for the federal government to make Islam the national religion. I said, what?
Right.
No, we're talking about what branch of the Christian religion would be made dominant, would be required to donate to.
Right.
Interestingly enough, they didn't even limit the power of the states to establish churches, which I think is a bad idea. I think it is contrary to the jurisdiction of civil government. Once the state can start saying, this is the definition of Christianity, it's no longer the church's authority. You are taking something from which God clearly places in the responsibility of the church, the keys of the kingdom, and the pillar and support of the truth. These are the two things that the church is. This is a summary of the major responsibilities of the church, and you are placing them both under the jurisdiction of the state once you allow the state to define what a church is.
Wow.
Right. So there's certain people that are there's certain areas of government that are essentially God's servant, that are God's servant, and you need to go to them to resolve a matter. And so we were in a situation this past week when we were at the LDS Conference Center. We were doing evangelism and outreach. Kind of a crazy situation. We saw what was probably about a 2-year-old child. It was a really. It was like I saw it. There's a family next to us that saw it who were actually LDS. We're all on the same page. Something here is not right. It was a child who's probably a little under 2 years old that was walking all by himself on the sidewalk.
Right.
Pretty much looked like an abandoned child. And we were looking around and we saw what maybe was the father, but he was probably at least 300 to 400 feet away. And the child's walking across one of those little places where the cars go in and park, like an embankment, where this kid could get hit by a car. And so, there's an instinctive to go run and I need to handle this vigilante style. But the reality is there's policemen, escorting traffic. So I knew the right thing to do because essentially the police are there. They're God's civil servant. I went to them because this is a matter that they need to handle. They have the authority that's been given to them by God. And so I went there, and thankfully the situation got resolved, but it's just a matter of where authority is delegated, for sure. So one of the questions I have, too, and maybe one of my observations, is that in the documentary there is this an assumption of neutrality. Right? As if,
It's not even an assumption, right? It's a projection of neutrality,
right?
They're not assuming it. They're projecting it. And
right.
They're saying, we're not, of course.
There's no way that they're doing the exact same thing. So, one, they were talking about how dangerous and scary it is that politicians would come together and have the audacity to pray. I mean, that has no place in American politics because, the founding fathers never, ever prayed at all when they're formulating our country at all, right?
Well, the fact that every president since Washington right up through and including Obama, I don't remember, Trump definitely did, I don't think Biden has yet, have declared there have been national days of prayer, and it's a regular thing. And this is one of the things that really speaks to it, because I kind of got a kick out of the documentary, even though it's wearying, there's so much BS to wade through.
Right.
They are accurately diagnosing errors in modern evangelical Christianity as it applies to the Bible, and as it comes from the Scripture. Is this really true? Is what I'm trying to say. Is this biblically correct? Mm-hmm. And then as there is being applied to law and public policy and civil society. Right. One of the major errors that modern Christianity makes as regards government is that we provide all of this cover for politicians. There's a reason why every president since Eisenhower has spoken at the National Prayer Breakfast. It's because they all know that you have to kiss the ring of evangelical Christianity in America today in order to stay in office. Why is it that Bill Clinton's, I'm a Christian, pray for me, I'm just, I have my failings and, and all that stuff. And why did George Bush, who was cut from exactly the same cloth, pray for me, the whole,
right.
It's because they are pandering to a certain base in order to get a vote. That is what it's about. Okay. It's all about duping there's a huge chunk of people who identify as evangelical Christians today. It is, in many cases, especially in primaries, the majority of the vote. Okay. And so even among Democrats, it's this huge chunk of people who are evangelical Christians.
Right.
You can look at the Democrat primary and say, how many of the core Hispanic vote, which is a big deal with the Democrats, are conservative Catholics. Huge majority. And so, not of the overall vote, but of the Hispanic vote. And so, being able to look like and talk like a Christian that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to have this cultural touchstone, right? And this is what at least since the 50s, probably before that, this is what people like Doug Coe have provided. And I think it's somewhat unwitting. And then they figure out that, this is how this works. And so there's this deal with the devil that will get to spread Christ, which is always what they were saying they were doing.
Right.
I question whether or not they were actually preaching the gospel that comes from the Bible, but that's their perspective. And in exchange, and I think it's a willing exchange, they'll be used by the politicians to get the vote, right? And that's what they're after.
Right.
And the documentary points that out in multiple ways and multiple times, and it's actually, I believe, true. It's an observable fact. And
right.
So I think that's what's going on.
All right. So another question too, because obviously our show is cultish, and so we focus primarily on cults and world religions, but I think it's fascinating when you think about the aspects of politics that are cultish. And here's an example, too, of just projection that you would see in this documentary, and I think is a two-way streets, because both sides of the aisle in American politics, they always pretend like the other one isn't doing it.
Right.
Where, back in the Obama administration, when he would do an executive order, everyone would panic and like, oh my gosh, Barack Obama, he's this horrible, awful dictator. And I remember... and although the right was like crying, foul play, and then all of a sudden, Trump gets elected. Of course, he does executive orders, and of course,
even more of them.
Oh yeah, and then the left starts panicking and like, oh no, foul play, and then all of a sudden, Biden comes in. He does the most amount of executive orders, so they always like pretend like the other one isn't doing it. So I find it fascinating that Steve Hassan, who wrote a great book, Combating Cult Mind Control. He's kind of known as America's cult expert. He wrote a book on the cult of Trump, and also talking about like how groups like QAnon and kind of that came out of it, where they're kind of looking at Trump as this really messianic figure. And people who hold to that perspective, and I think they were kind of appealing to that in episode 5. But in the same way, they're acting as if that never happened with Barack Obama when he came into office, when he was running for office. Like I remember distinctly during the Democratic National Convention in Denver, when he came out and did his presidential speech, and they had this like giant Greek Colosseum, and like they're all talking very openly like Barack Obama was the Messiah. Right, he was this
very messianic.
Very messianic. This very Jesus complex. And when he came out there, before he even started talking, you saw people who were just like crying uncontrollably. This guy that nobody really knew, he had been this Illinois senator for 2 years, and everyone's doing that. My point is that both sides of the aisle, pretend like the other one isn't doing that. Yes. From your perspective, like what are some examples that you see just in the world of politics in general that is cult-like?
I believe it comes from the core human tendency to seek salvation somewhere other than Christ. And in many cases, you can look at it throughout history. You can look at ancient pagan nations, and you can look at England, the Empire of England, and you can look at the Empire of the United States of America. Unfortunately, we have become an empire against our own core beliefs. But in this imperial perspective, we have to have this salvation, and salvation comes from something other than Christ. And it will always be creeping in because it's in everyone's hearts. Our unredeemed nature doesn't like having to humble ourselves before God. We don't.
Right.
This is not our thing.
Dude, I think what you're saying is extremely powerful because the biblical separation between church and state is a real thing. So thank the Bible for that. Thank God for that.
Correct.
Right. It's institutional. So what Zach is saying right now is the issue that we have in America is people are forgetting that the state's supposed to be a minister of God, a diakonos.
Right.
It's a deacon of God, essentially. That's like what the magistrate's supposed to do. But what they're doing, if they're not actually falling and bowing their knee to Christ, they're going to look for a savior in the president when that was never what the president's duty was in the first place. He was supposed to be a servant of God, and he's still held to that standard by Jesus Christ because Jesus Christ is living and reigning now and judges the nations in the present.
And it's one of the catch-22s of American existence. We came off a world in which we did not like the central power of a king, and there was much complaining that George Washington would become just the American king. And he actually worked very hard not to. But there was still this need in people, and we tend to look at historical, especially whatever history we like, we tend to think, oh, those people were better, those people were different, they were not as sinful as us humans today,
Right.
And then there's the overreaction that no, they were more sinful, right? And the whole thing, it's like what a stupid argument. They were fallen, sinful human beings, and we bring it on ourselves when we have to say that, oh well, we have these great American founding fathers, they have halos. And no, they were fallen, sinful human beings. And the fallen, sinful human beings that made up Americans in the federal era, which is right after the founding, glorified and probably over-focused on who's the president and how it's supposed to. The founding fathers on both sides. You have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? And they had this big debate over how it's going to be done. And they all actually agreed that, look, the president really shouldn't be that big a deal. It's really not. And in fact, you can look at, there's fascinating interplay between the United States of America and Switzerland. Fascinating things that we traded on. They borrowed our constitutional form of government whole cloth, and they're very open about it. They looked at it and said, we like this, and they took it. We borrowed their military format whole cloth, the whole concept of not having a standing army, and we have an officer corps that is professional soldiers, but when you need to fight a war, you call up the citizens who are supposed to be being trained, and that is what the militia is. It's not this group of Joe and Frank and Bubba all out playing, army with camo paint and 20-year-old BDUs. It's supposed to be actually governed by the local civil government, which is how it was originally, and how Switzerland is to this day.
Wow.
And so Switzerland actually, in some ways, I think, captures the spirit of what a federal comes from the old Latin word for covenantal. It's that F-O-E, federal, which is what it means. It means covenantal.
Wow.
There's going to be a law, and it will govern how everybody works, and that's what a covenant is.
Right.
And so the Swiss federal system, you have they have the cantons, which are the states, right? And you've got the different, and they've got their governments, and you've got a federal government, and no one really cares who the president of Switzerland is. He walks down the street, there's no bodyguards, no one says, "Oh, hey, look, it's the president." They don't know who he is. They don't care. He does his job, but he's not the central figure in politics, right?
Right.
This whole idea that who's the most powerful man in the world, right? It's the president of the United States, right? That's the whole shtick, and that wasn't really even used in America until that really weird period right after World War II, where Harry Truman was the only man who could actually call in a nuclear missile strike because the Russians didn't have it yet.
Oh wow!
And that goes back to the first time anyone was referred to as the most powerful man in the world in modern, in context of the American president. Was that period. And so it continues to be something, it's the part of the legend of America, right? It's part of our identity that we're the big dog, right?
Right.
And that imperial perspective and that hyper focus on the president is exactly what you're talking about. And when we have problems, what's the problem from the left's perspective? It's intersectionality, right? The problem is that there are varying degrees of persecution, and the more of those things you can add up, the more you have intersections of persecution, the more points you should have, right? And what's the solution for that? Well, obviously, we elected a black person to be president. Right. We would be being absolved of guilt. It would have been better if it had been a woman, and probably a black transgender woman, whatever that is.
Yeah, trying to cover.
I'm not a biologist,
of,
so
right.
I don't know.
Throw that in there. Oh, that's funny.
You see, that's where you had this. At least he was black, right? And that's going to save us. And then you have Trump. Well, at least he's not a hypocrite, and at least he pays lip service to America. At least he's America first, whatever. And now he's the salvation from the other side. And yes, that's exactly what both sides are doing. It's wrong. It's immoral. We should instead, and that's where, you watch The Family and they're like accusing, you guys are bad because you're supporting a racist, right? Trump is a racist and he loves Russia. Of course, It's laughable now to watch that. Everyone knows. The left knows. They're constantly, no, it's not true, making flat denials that Biden and his family are much more deeply entwined in all Russia politics.
Yeah, they talked about that Russian lady who's like a firearms expert, and somehow that was like the Russia collusion, which was pushed for 2 years. I was trying to remember, because right now in the news is the war between Russia and Ukraine, but that was like the big thing that was being pushed back then was the Russia collusion. So you could just tell that there's definitely a political bias slant towards it for sure.
Right.
But I have a question too. Obviously you're very involved, and this is focused in on the prayer breakfast and Doug Coe. And so, what you're basically articulating is that, you need to view primarily as a Christian first, view the role of government strictly through a biblical lens before anything else. And then you don't want to have the cart before the horse. But what are your thoughts on Doug Coe and just the prayer breakfast as a whole? If you just take away the slant of just the documentary or just that organization as a whole, just from your perspective, if you just be fair and call balls and strikes, what do you think? Do you think there's areas in which they're doing things right, or what are some areas which you think they're off at?
Well, I never did meet Doug Coe. He passed away before I was really deeply involved in any of that. And so, the National Prayer Breakfast is an event, the family. I don't really know how much of that documentary is accurate and how much of it is just a total fabrication. You can watch it and you can sniff fabrication the way they've got shots of, there's supposed to be all these like records and documents. They never ever say that this is actually, we got into some archives and they're just presenting it. And they do make it clear that this is a docudrama. They've got especially as they establish Jeff Charlotte's, he's the undercover guy who wrote the books and is kind of central to the whole thing, produced it.
Right.
They've got all this docudrama stuff where they've got actors playing all the Doug Coe, and these are major faces that you recognize if you watch any TV at all. These are people all over, and so I come away from that saying, yeah, there's a lot of fabrication, a lot of inference. They may not be they're trying to avoid lying, right, and being accused of that, but they're inferring all this stuff about the evil that's going on. But there are some things that ring true, and so I'm going to speak to it from that perspective, not as someone who's an expert in any of this. But as far as something that I do propose that I at least have studied and have looked into a lot is the rise of what's called the Christian right, and the influence that it's had. The National Prayer Breakfast and the family and C Street and the Fellowship, whatever we're going to call it. Is simply an outworking of that larger perspective. You can go back to right after World War II, you've got this perspective that says, okay, we're fighting communism now, and there's national security, and America is suddenly thrust into being the major player in world politics, right? Mm-hmm. Up until that point, before World War I, that wasn't even a thing. After World War I, okay, now New York City became the financial hub of the world, and there's this very obvious shift from it being London and to being New York. And so you've got that era, but you still had people who said, look, we shouldn't be involved in the world. We're not the world's policemen. They're labeled isolationists today.
Right.
And so after World War II, that was pretty much gone. And so there's this reorienting of how politics works. Our concept of American politics as being conservatives and leftists, right and left. That whole thing really didn't exist until after World War II. There were progressives, and you have the Whig Party, and you've got all these different things going on throughout American history. But our modern concept goes back to that time. And so as that grew up, you have people who are wondering, hey, how do we preserve liberty and freedom and constitutional concepts? But a lot of that became tied up in this idea that somehow being an evangelical Christian and representing Christ on a personal level, which those things are all good, but it kind of became this thing where it's almost at odds with holding a direct, specific position. And there's this huge chunk of Christianity that says, you know what, if we go and we just be personally Christian, we have personal Christian morals. We're not sleeping around. We're not, and it goes back to fundamentalism. A lot of it seeps into that. And I don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls that do. Right. That's the laughing summary of what does it mean to be personally Christian. And so it grows up to be this fundamentalist perspective, unfortunately. And so it's this horrible mixing, right? It's this admixture of some things that are true and some things that are just made up. And so that, I think, has this huge impact. And then you've got the watershed moment of the 1964 elections with Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is a U.S. Senator from Arizona, a really interesting guy. And he brings forward an idea that it's not okay for people to call themselves conservatives and Republicans and to vote with the left, right? It's not okay to be what we would call a rhino today. And that concept of a Republican in name only, which is where rhino comes from, goes back to the Barry Goldwater days. Tomorrow I'll be having lunch with Morton Blackwell, who's one of the last living Barry Goldwater activists. At the time, I have the deepest respect for Morton. He's just a great guy. Formed the Leadership Institute. But the people that he would have worked with, and this is no criticism of Morton at all, but the people that he would have worked with in the world he came up in as a very young activist in the 1960s, as they were saying, yeah, you know what, it's not okay to just go along to get along. We're going to have a fight. We're going to have a war. And it came down to the 1964 Republican convention, in which Goldwater won the nomination by being hardcore and by saying, we're going to fight against certain ideologies. We're going to fight big government. We're going to fight gun control, and we're going to fight on the social issues, even though Goldwater wasn't a strong social warrior on abortion or things like that. Obviously, this is 10 years before Roe v. Wade, but let's not fool ourselves and say that abortion was invented in 1973, right?
Right.
And so that gave rise to Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Jim Dobson, what became to be known as the Christian right. The silent majority is a term that Jerry Falwell coined. And once Barry Goldwater took the nomination and then lost one of the biggest losses in American history to Lyndon Baines Johnson, you have this 16-year period between 1964 and 1980, in which you've got all the conservative movement is kind of in the wilderness, right? You have the young Ronald Reagan, who was the one who introduced Goldwater at convention. He was this young up-and-coming rising star who became the governor of California. And you think California, no, California was a red bastion in the 60s and 70s. And so during this whole period, you've got this odd development where you've got this huge fundamental stripe. You've got all of this perspective on what it is, what does it mean to be biblical? What does it mean to be a Christian? And that whole problem finally wins when Ronald Reagan becomes president, right? Now, Ronald Reagan, he was an interesting dude. He did many things right. He did a whole bunch of stuff wrong. He was a lot like Trump without the objectionable. He was just a really enjoyable guy. They called him the Gipper because he could tell jokes. Everybody liked him, and it was very difficult to not like Ronald Reagan.
He was just witty. Like he had like the one time, I think it was the very first time he debated Jimmy Carter. which you talk about too, just like when you talk about the
Yes.
cultish world of politics, it goes both ways.
Yes.
Like in many ways, when you're in those public debates or even political ads, that's almost a perfect example of just persuasion or sometimes manipulation of how you prey on people's fears. Jumping back to Barry Goldwater, there's always, for presidents who have lost an election, there always were those definitive moments that buried someone.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about one of the most decisive political ads, and this is Barry Goldwater was still kind of in the infancy of real television influencing politics and things like that, was that classic commercial of the little girl who's in her who's in right outside her house, and all of a sudden it was talking about whatever his perspective was on foreign policy, and it showed an atomic bomb go off in the background.
Right.
And so I remember that was a commercial. It's very famous. Like that was one of the definitive ads that buried Goldwater in his campaign as far as just really influencing public persuasion. But even look at Reagan, and he was, when I think in his first debate with Jimmy Carter, just saying like little things like "there you go again," or the things that he would do.
Right.
Like you definitely would see that aspect as well too.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And you had, you can talk about that election. You have two men who both claim to be evangelical Christians, right?
Yeah.
In that case, the Democrat claim that somehow we can be Christian and now we can be on the pro-abortion side because it's more, and that was long the argument. That somehow we can be soft on that, and somehow being Christian means being anti-gun, because that's the Christian perspective, and somehow being Christian means being pro forced. What's the word? Forced. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank, but the government requiring you to help other people, right? Forced generosity, required generosity. That's the word I'm looking for. These are all things that that have become part and parcel now, and it's so much part of the Democrat perspective that it's not really even about Christianity anymore. But even so, look up Joe Biden. What's his religion?
Roman Catholic?
Yeah. He's marked down as a Christian. Joe Biden is a Christian, right? And he professes Christ that's his faith.
Right.
And so even today, even in the midst of all of this, what is the argument presented for being a leftist in America? Well, Jesus was kind of a communist. That's kind of his perspective,
right?
The communist Jesus. So the idea that somehow faith is divorced from public life is laughable.
Right.
No one actually believes that. When you actually have to motivate the voters, you make an appeal to faith.
Right.
That's what they do. But both sides are doing it incorrectly.
Oh, yeah. And even
wrong.
what the documentary indicates is somehow this is strictly a right-wing catalyst as far as the prayer breakfast goes.
Right.
I mean, you have both sides kissing the ring of evangelicalism, like you say, and even, I didn't look up the speech, but even in this last year, Joe Biden spoke for 20 to 30 minutes at the National Prayer Breakfast.
Right.
And, they're still trying to make that sort of appeal, whether you call it an appeal, pandering, whatever, what have you. I mean, it's both sides.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at even, people make a big deal, for example, about Biden trying to appeal as an evangelical in some way. Well, Trump did the exact same thing when he was running in 2016. Right. He was talking about, you remember he was like 2 Corinthians,
Right.
Like yeah. I made a joke like 2 Corinthians walk into a bar, so you have that. And I think he was asking like what his favorite Bible verse is. And he's like, no, it's I love every part of the Bible. It's all very precious to me. I don't have a particular verse. Like he was trying to like dance around it like Donald Trump would.
Well, if you take the Bible as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm all about the totality of Scripture. So that's kind of what like scares me a little bit in terms of thinking about the left, even in the far right that you guys are talking about. There seems to be a redefining of biblical terms, right? And like, and the worry with cultish is what cultic groups do is they actually reinterpret the Bible to their own morality, their own language. They make it say whatever it wants to say instead of reading it in context.
Being changed by it.
Right, because when we have, let's say like the far left, for example, appealing to laws, they're appealing to immaterial, transcendent things, right? Mm-hmm. And there has to be a lawgiver. But if you end up changing the laws, it's going to reflect a different character and nature of the lawgiver.
Right.
But we know there's only one lawgiver who gave us his law, and we don't have the right to redictate the laws that he has already given. They're actually appealing to a different God in that sense if the laws contradicts the law of the Bible. So you've kind of explained going from Barry Goldwater to now, like, how part of this separation occurred in, let's just say, the American thought process. Would you say part of that issue is because the church doesn't actually do the job that it's supposed to have according to the function from the Bible as of speaking truth and keeping it consistent and immutable to the state?
There is an attitude that says, well, Christianity just deals with your personal life, and as long as you deal with personal life and preach Christ, everything else will sort itself out, right? And this is an idea that even infiltrates modern heroes. You can look at MacArthur today and see, and this is a man who I always said when push comes to shove, he's going to cave because he says that we shouldn't be involved in politics at all. We should just preach Christ and let the chips fall, right? Now, I was wrong. When push came to shove and the state did tell him you can't preach Christ anymore, he said, well, then put me in jail. I'll have a great prison ministry. Yeah. Right? And they said, Amen. All right, we give up. We're sorry. Right. And so... but MacArthur still, to this day, maintains that you really don't apply Christ to government, right? You only apply him to personal life, and that'll somehow sort itself out, which is just bad theology, to quote Jerry's shirt. Mm-hmm. It's just wrong. Yeah. You can't come away from Psalm 2 and Romans 13 and say, well, clearly the magistrate should not be speaking directly to, or the minister should not be speaking directly to the magistrate in his public role. His personal life, yes, right? You can be a member of your church and you can serve Christ personally, but we're going to come away and say that, but as the Bible applies to government, well, it's not clear. And that's just a distraction. Somehow that harms the preaching of the gospel. That's the modern perspective. And it's a reaction. I'm sorry, hang on, but it's a reaction that it is a reaction to the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, when they came in and said, no, that it does apply, and here's how it applies. Don't drink, don't chew, don't smoke, and goes with girls that do. I messed that up. It's smoke, drink, and chew, right? But that was the moral majority, right? We're going to have laws that say we're on the side of prohibition when it comes to drugs. That's a huge part of, we still have people today who are walking in that, who are their entire goal is to keep marijuana from being legalized. And that is somehow an application of the Bible. Well, look, we can talk about the social ills and all of that, but this is not a direct connect. Right. The Bible does not command, thou shalt not smoke a joint. I'm sorry. It commands many things that are very important. Yeah. And there are commands that govern whether or not you smoke a joint. For the record, I never have. I have no interest in it. It doesn't really excite me. But I'm sorry, the Bible doesn't say that. Yeah. You can go into other things. Let's talk about the perspective as the religious right, which is where the whole thing is, where Doug Coe came from my perspective when I look at it. You have, and he would remove himself. Well, I don't get into that, right? This is Jesus and nothing else, right? Mm-hmm. And that, I don't know if he actually said that, but that's what's being presented, right? Well, that itself might be this reaction to saying, well, from the moral majority perspective, from the Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson perspective, we're going to send people into the federal government in order to defund the left and start funneling that money into the conservative cause, and we're going to give money. And I have friends, some of whom are gone now, who were part of that structure, and they were recruited and went into civil service, especially in Republican administrations, presidential administrations, in order to funnel money away from the left because they're milking the federal system dry and put it into conservative causes. We're actually using federal dollars to advance our own ideology because, hey, the left does it. If we don't do it, we're going to be in trouble. Well, that's outrageous. We all agree that that's unconstitutional. Our side, well, yes, it is, but if the left's going to do it, we have to do it too. Mm. This is one of the things that has become, this is what it means to be a conservative. We have to do this. And yeah, now thankfully that has largely gone away. Conservatives now are much more governed by recognizing that, hey, that's not right, but then we secretly do it. How many conservative organizations took the Paycheck Protection Program money, the PPP money, and to keep their conservative 501c4s, churches, C3s, they all took that money in order to keep themselves. Well, what is that? That's exactly, it grows from this perspective that somehow that's what we should be doing.
Wow, you're just blowing my mind here. But what it makes me think of is salvation through policy.
Yeah.
Right? It's like a works-based salvation in a way, when the real issue at hand is that the gospel needs to be preached, and we need the Holy Spirit to cause people to observe his statutes. Like, so policy as salvation is the reason why abortion is still legal here.
Right, because we're going to regulate it carefully and slowly, or why we've lost the battle when it comes to fighting the homosexual bullies. What's the argument? Well, homosexuals can't have children, so clearly they shouldn't be able to be married. And the whole discussion is whether or not we're going to allow homosexuals to marry. That's the discussion. It became, what is the entire debate framed, because the right framed it as not, wait a minute, where does this fit in? What does the Bible actually say about homosexuality in public? No. We can't talk about that. We have to, because that's embarrassing. We have to talk about whether or not they can get married, because that's one of the stops along the way. Right?
Which is one of the whole episodes is focused about, their involvement with leaders in both in Uganda, but also I think it was in Romania, about this exact issue.
Yes. Yep.
And one other thing too, just as we wrap up the first part of this episode too, when you're talking about trying almost like this workspace salvation, kind of looking at the external ethics in order to push push conservative values or quote unquote Christian values. When you think about Reagan's war on drugs, don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, all that sort of stuff. But if you look at what is one of the major aspects, one of the major consequences of the war on drugs, is that to this day, there are thousands and thousands of people who are image bearers of God that are in a cage, that are in prison. In many ways, in a very unjust way, with no chance of restitution. They're permanently in this caste system where they're a second-class citizen, and there's no ability for ultimate restitution for them to pay to atone for these sins.
Restored.
And so, and it's done under it was done under the guise of virtue.
Correct, under the guise of Christian virtue.
Right.
Look. The modern production of what we call drugs it has a horrible effect on a civil society. And so I can understand people who say, look, we have to combat this somehow. Look, I get it. I understand. But we've done it for 50 years now, okay? And who's won the war on drugs? Drugs won the war on drugs, okay? Everyone has to admit it now.
Yeah.
And that's because government prohibition doesn't fix a problem. Yep. You found a legitimate social ill. This is real. And the solution ended up being worse than the problem because it made the core problem worse. It's not like we hadn't done this before. It's not like we couldn't go back to the 20s and say, hey, did prohibition work? No, it actually created the entire structure and the entire infrastructure for distributing stuff that's illegal. Guess where that came from? It didn't exist in America in that way until we made it astronomically productive, astronomically beneficial to become a rum runner. And we built it so that you could everyone had enough money to make these cars that could drive faster.
Supply and demand.
Right. And so we created this huge demand through that. And once
we created Al Capone.
Right. And once alcohol, we recognized, okay, prohibition was a really stupid idea. Again, it was a huge social ill. And William Jennings Bryan had this great speech when prohibition finally took effect. And they were just weeping and crying that they had fixed this huge social ill. And in reality, the men who passed the law, they saw the advantage of getting in front of a huge political wave that now will be popular, and they passed the 19th. It was the 19th, right? No. Anyway, they passed prohibition. I can't remember the number now. And they went and they celebrated by having illicit alcohol. Okay. They all had their stocks. They had their stores. They bought them before. They had it ready to go. And everyone just kind of sniggered that, oh, yeah, right. You're going to limit a populace that's really good at avoiding laws they don't like, which America is remarkably good at that.
Right. And even as we wrap up here is indicative of the HBO show Boardwalk Empire. Steve Buscemi's primary character, I think he was a Republican senator who's advocating for prohibition. And as soon as prohibition goes into effect, he has his own liquor distribution to give it to the people who want to have it illegally. It's like you can you can't. There is a reality where you can't legislate morality because inside people are still idolatrous. You have Steve Buscemi who basically basically thinks he's God. He can do whatever he wants, and there's nothing new under the sun. We have people in today in office, both Republican and Democrat, who basically think they're God, they can do whatever else. But then you have people who ultimately they're idolatrous in the sense to where the bottle is their idol, and they'll do whatever necessary to make sure that distribution's there. And so in that sense, you can't legislate it. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap up part 1 here. We're going to kind of jump more into the interesting aspects of this documentary, the family, and really just kind of the world of politics as a whole, but also different aspects too of the ins and outs of some of the interesting aspects of right-wing conservatism. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this sort of interesting and politically charged episode. It should be interesting to see the comments that we get. But if you all enjoyed this episode, definitely leave a comment on our social media. Let us know what you thought. And as always, a program like this cannot continue without your support. So if you feel led to support Cultish, go to thecultishtshow.com. You can go to the donate tab, donate one time or monthly. All that being said, we'll talk to you in part 2, where we talk about the family on Cultish. Talk to you guys soon.